Story 1. For the past 20 years, the United States has been a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. During our elections, they send over 100 delegates from other member countries to monitor the elections. These delegates are placed in major swing states to ensure the election and ballot tally are accurate. Story 2. Regular people hear the United Nations and think it is some futuristic one-world government that has resolved every dispute and represents the pinnacle of humanity united. The United Nations has all the conflicts of interest, biases, and power struggles that any other governing body has. This premise reflects a misunderstanding of what the world is. Story 3. The same United Nations that has China and Saudi Arabia leading the Human Rights Council? The same United Nations that receives the majority of its resources from the United States? Now, Story 4. Sure. Let's have a bureaucratic and inefficient group dealing with their own power imbalance come in and resolve matters for us. Story 5. Do you honestly think this election was rigged? Just because every feed on your social media is left-leaning and you have abandoned your Trump-supporting friends, and you attend every left-leaning protest, it does not mean your president somehow mysteriously came to power. I know it's hard to accept, but more than half of the country voted for him. They are all around you, you just refuse to see them. Story 6. Who is supporting this questionable question? Why would an international regulatory body responsible for managing conflicts between international parties have any concerns about a domestic election? Story 7. The United Nations only has the power it does because the United States supports it. The United States would withdraw from the United Nations before it happened. Consider the International Atomic Energy Agency. They inspect nuclear power plants around the world, except in the United States. This is because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards are higher, and the Commission provides assistance from time to time. In either case, the issue with American elections begins long before ballots are cast. The location and accessibility of polling places, voter purges, and uncertainty about whether one can vote are significant obstacles to voting in the United States. Story 8. Maybe if people are concerned about the security and validity of elections, they would vote to require voter identification. Story 9.1. We are members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which promotes democratic standards. 2. The issues with American elections do not begin on ballot day. They start with campaign funding, polling locations, voter ID laws that do not provide easily obtainable identification, polling hours, disinformation, and misinformation. All of these factors are observable. The purpose of campaigning is to disseminate the message, and there is no concealed government intervention in elections. Story 10. Honestly, if the United States can send observers to monitor elections in other countries, it's only fair we return the favor. Half the country thinks every election is rigged, while the other half believes the first half is delusional. Maybe it's time for mature oversight. The United Nations walks in asking, "So, where's the democracy you keep exporting?" Don't worry, Florida will still find a way to lose ballots and blame an alligator. Story 11. Why are they monitoring international conflicts and humanitarian interests, rather than just domestic ones? Some countries represented in the United Nations do not prioritize the best interests of the United States. Story 12. Right after the United Nations conducts an impartial vote in Israel, likely managed by Hamas, with logistics possibly handled by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Story 13. They are about as credible as the International Federation of Association Football, so not great. If a more reputable institution existed, I would be delighted. Story 14. We've shown that we cannot be trusted to have free and fair elections, so I would be relieved to have responsible individuals present. Story 15. Not necessary and would cause more harm than help. It would also likely decrease trust rather than increase it. Story 16. As an American who would jump at the chance to move to at least half of the European Union countries, absolutely not. Story 17. The United Nations does not conduct direct observation. They can assist with matters that the United States has already established. However, their support would not necessarily eliminate potential fraud. This approach does not represent a solution, let alone address the issue. Story 18. Virginia had both foreign and federal observers in the 2024 presidential election. I am unsure what the issue is here. Story 19. I wouldn't trust the United Nations to monitor elections in this country. Liberals would get away with anything, and any challenge by a conservative or a Republican would be denied. Story 20. They monitored other elections, such as in Turkey, declared the results invalid, and had no impact. Story 21. Breaking news. New York City has acquired a new apartment building. It features classic mid-century modern architecture. Story 22. The only oversight that will be tolerated is by Putin because he is a good person and a great friend of America. Story 23. I remember watching a documentary on the assault during the war in Kosovo. Combatants would enter crowds of people, grab someone, and you would never see that person again. I am not really sure what the purpose of having United Nations observers would be. Story 24. Belgrade's Serbian President Vojislav Koštunica deployed over 30,000 peacekeeping troops to the United States on Monday, pledging full support to the troubled North American nation as it struggles to establish democracy. Story 25. They already do. I am a precinct chairman, so I have to check the credentials of the press and poll monitors. We had a 3-person monitoring team visit us during the presidential election. It was the first time I had seen credentials issued by the State Department. They asked a few questions, observed for half an hour, and then moved on to another city. Story 26. The individuals who do not trust United States election results are the same individuals who do not trust the United Nations. So this hypothetical scenario is categorized as unlikely to occur. Story 27. A shrug and a dismissive gesture. The United Nations is not a government. It is a labor union. The strong do not need a union. The weak do. The United States is strong. It does not need the United Nations. The only benefit the United States gains from being part of or hosting the United Nations is having the most insider knowledge on what other countries are discussing. Story 28. According to the United Nations, electoral assistance is provided only at the specific request of the member state concerned, or based on a mandate from the Security Council or General Assembly. I doubt the United States will request it. Story 29. I'm not saying the United States doesn't need some form of election integrity monitoring. It desperately does. However, there would be significant consequences. I know the United Nations has monitored elections during civil wars, but I am still unsure they could handle the situation. Story 30. The U.S. elections have historically been very secure. Even Trump supporters know his accusations are unfounded and explain it away with, "That's just the way he talks." The only thing that has been increasing is foreign countries trying to influence elections in both directions. There is no law against that. It is just unwise to do. We can clearly see why it is foolish from recent events like Trump's first impeachment. Trump was impeached for withholding weapons aid to Ukraine because President Zelensky refused to fabricate evidence against Hunter Biden. Trump strongly dislikes Zelensky because of this and is making decisions that are counter to the national interest and often even his own interests because of the dispute. Any competent politician can foresee these kinds of problems and abstains from election interference, to use a commonly used term. Story 31. It is a great idea, but the task is too complex. If you want fair elections, you need to eliminate gerrymandering and lobbying, both of which are established in United States law. Story 32. Great idea. While we are at it, let's have the United Nations monitor the Fédération Internationale de Football Association to ensure that World Cup decisions are fair as well. Story 33. You realize the United Nations enforcement is just the United States military, right? It would literally be the United States monitoring its own elections. Story 34. I'd say that would essentially be handing over our sovereignty to one of the most incompetent organizations in the world and would no longer consider our elections valid. That wouldn't be my president, and I would be obligated to take my country back. Story 35. Fantasyland is what I think of it. Childish. No one is going to swoop in and save us, let alone an organization that allows the United States to illegally invade countries, conduct drone strikes on civilians without declaring war, and refuses to acknowledge genocide. Wake up and get to work. The United Nations will not fix anything. Story 36. The United Nations is not a reliable organization for protecting democracy. Because it operates on a one-country, one-vote basis, and there are currently more autocratic and autocrat-leaning countries than actual democracies, the end result would be that every single United States election is called into question as a matter of policy. The United Nations serves as a forum that provides poorer countries with a de facto world-class diplomatic corps for free, which is commendable. In any other role, it is a complete failure. Its ineffectiveness is also the only reason it still exists, as the veto power of the permanent members is both the reason it cannot take effective action and the reason the major powers continue to participate. Story 37. I wouldn't mind if it was called upon once to monitor an election after a constitutional crisis, but the idea of having the United Nations essentially supervise a sovereign nation's elections indefinitely, with the implicit ability to declare the results of that election invalid, just doesn't seem right to me. Whether it's the United States, Russia, or Myanmar, it doesn't seem acceptable. Story 38. After the 2024 election, which was obviously fraudulent, we should all demand voter identification, paper ballots, in-person voting, and bipartisan poll watchers. Story 39. Hello, everyone. I am Rohit Kumar from Shawnee Business School, batch 2023 to 2025, and I am conducting research on the role of job descriptions in employer branding. Your responses will help us understand how well-crafted job descriptions impact a company's image and attract the right talent. It will only take a few minutes, and your input would be greatly appreciated. Please take a moment to fill out the form and share it with others who might be interested. Thank you. Story 40. Americans cannot even agree on requiring identification to vote. Why would they ever agree on having the United Nations involved? Story 41. I would tell them to leave if they weren't monitoring each and every constituent nation's elections with equal scrutiny. There are plenty of member nations with clearly manipulated elections, and they do not seem to care about that. Story 42. It would be unwise. The United Nations is dominated by authoritarian countries. It will not ensure fair elections and may enable Trump to cheat. Story 43. The United Nations can achieve that in some countries because it has leverage through the member nations. However, that is not the case here. Story 44. What is the point when the wealthy can just pay their way into whatever candidate they prefer and control their actions? Story 45. The conspiracy involving various groups goes all the way to the top. Story 46. The United Nations is largely an extension of American influence. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization serves as the enforcer while the United Nations plays the supportive role. This situation resembles police investigating themselves. This is also why the United Nations allowed Canada to conduct its own investigation into allegations of genocide. Story 47. It could be a good idea if there are doubts about the fairness of the elections or if there are accusations of manipulation. However, the United States is a sovereign country, and many might oppose external monitoring of their elections. It is important to find a balance where there is oversight without compromising sovereignty. Story 48. It's not like they can enforce anything, and we are aware of foreign and internal interference in the election already. We have solid proof, but people just throw up their hands anyway. Story 49. You cannot have a delegate sitting everywhere, but you can have one from each party observing the others. I do not know how it works in the United States, but that is how voting and counting are conducted here. Story 50. The idea of the United Nations monitoring United States elections is a complex and politically charged issue. On one hand, international monitoring can help ensure that elections are free, fair, and transparent, which is important for upholding democratic processes. On the other hand, many people in the United States might view it as an infringement on national sovereignty or as unnecessary, given the country's long history of conducting elections. Story 51. American elections are incredibly secure and transparent and already have international oversight. This would be redundant. Story 52. It wouldn't help. The Make America Great Again crowd might just say that the monitors were passing mints to each other instead of actually watching the vote counting. Story 53. The next midterms will be for show only. Your elections have been compromised since universal suffrage was introduced. The difference going forward is that only one party will ever win again. Your limited democracy is over. Story 54. Apparently, you are unaware of how large the United States is and how many voting locations there are throughout the country. Story 55. Bring the Peace Corps to Africa, similar to what was done during the Civil Rights era. Many people have forgotten that. Story 56. A solution that would be worse than the problem. I would welcome NATO, the European Union, or even Canada to monitor the elections. However, I do not view the United Nations as a trustworthy observer. Story 57. You might get away with this in a few places, but not in Republican-leaning rural areas. Talk radio has been warning them about globalism for decades, and they would never stand for foreign influences trying to oversee our elections. Zero chance. Story 58. How would I feel? Probably like I do now, knowing I can't express my thoughts to the original poster without facing the risk of being banned from this subreddit. Story 59. They were denied visas by the Trump administration when he was putting children and babies in cages. Story 60. All for it. If they are not doing anything wrong, then there is nothing to hide. And if there is some wrongdoing, then let us get all the help we can to ensure what the people say on their ballot is actually heard. Story 61. I have no problem with that. I have been saying for many years that countries should not be allowed to run their own elections. Keeps everyone honest. Story 62. Your problem isn't elections, but the separation of powers and your voting system in general. It is basically built for a dictator to take over. Story 63. They should. There's no way that Orange Duffus won the presidency again without external influence. Story 64. That would be a great decision if you wanted the United Nations to have the power to disqualify a candidate they do not support. What benefit do you think that would provide? Story 65. Someone other than the vice president needs to monitor it. No doubt Elon Musk had someone rig the last one. Story 66. I think it is a fantastic way for United Nations peacekeepers to end up dead. Trump would never stand for a threat to his authority. Story 67. I would be fine. In fact, based on everything I hear from those who prioritize law and order, everyone should be fine. After all, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, right? Story 68. If they could establish a trustworthy system, it might be necessary to prevent foreign powers or hackers from altering votes, and to ensure both parties' voters feel confident that their votes are secure. However, it would require a reasonable level of agreement among politicians and voters, and I'm uncertain that will happen. Story 69. There was something strange about the last presidential election. Harris was filling arenas and turning people away, while Trump could not get 10,000 out for his rallies. Yet somehow Trump won all of the swing states. Something feels wrong there. Story 70. The problem is that some individuals would not believe the United Nations either. They would likely think there was a conspiracy involving liberals, Jews, and the United Nations. Donald Trump and the MAGA movement have undermined truth and trust in institutions. Story 71. I would love to see that happen. I don't believe in election integrity anymore. I believe the Republicans are cheating. We can't be this naive. Story 72. Something definitely happened during this last election. I think it was planned over the last couple of years, and Elon Musk played a part in it. Kamala Harris had stadiums full of people, many more than Trump did. Then Trump wins. Something doesn't add up. Story 73. We are at that point. You will never convince me that Trump actually won. He was facing jail if Harris won. Jack Smith had him dead to rights. He was desperate. When he bragged about Musk understanding the tabulating computers in Pennsylvania, it should have triggered hand recounts immediately. Story 74. Half the country is convinced that requiring voters to present identification is racist. And you want the United Nations to be involved? How much unnecessary oversight and bureaucracy do people really want in this world? What is even this question? Story 75. Haha. It is not going to happen. First, Orange is never going to give it up. Second, the only way to reset is through civil war, simply because the Republicans won't admit they are wrong. Story 76. The United Nations has two modes, 1. Wildly ineffective. 2. Very biased. It resembles the United States election process a bit too much for my taste. Story 77. The same United Nations that the United States has a veto on and literally uses it to cover up their and their allies' war crimes? Sure, that would work. The United Nations, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is just power projection of Western hegemony. It does nothing but point to the East and South and label them as bad guys, while never taking any moral position that questions the legitimacy or superiority of those Western powers. The United States is in decline. It can't be trusted, even after Trump's departure. The damage is done. The best course of action is to cut ties, trade with the European Union and China, and let them see just how much they relied on soft power to maintain their influence. Story 78. I support it, but I still want transparency and independent verification. Those individuals never stop lying and cheating, and they will continue to do so. Story 79. As much as I distrust Don and JD, I do not want an international organization determining whether our elections are legitimate. We have been having legitimate elections for centuries. I certainly hope 2 terms under Trump are not enough to destroy that tradition. Story 80. I would approve. Too many anomalies were found this year that no one in power addresses. Something is wrong. Please refer to the 2024 supplement for further reading, especially Spoonamore's duty to warn letter. Story 81. You and what army? Seriously, what if the United Nations finds voting irregularities? Then what? Censure the United States? Isolate us more than Trump already has? Invade? Set up a fair democratic government? Will we slip further than we already have in the Human Rights Index? What is the point and goal of having United Nations monitors? Story 82. The same United Nations that employs Hamas members but not Israelis and goes on endlessly about how bad Israel is, while portraying Hamas as good. Is that the bastion of impartiality, the United Nations? Yes, hard pass. Story 83. It makes no sense to do this. Each country is responsible for its own government. If the United States wants to be corrupt, then let it be corrupt. It is not the only nation in the United Nations that is corrupt. Story 84. Why do you think the election is rigged? Or maybe the election didn't go your way, so you want the United Nations to ensure it goes your way? What is your motivation for this suggestion? I believe everyone should stay out of others' elections. If you want to monitor another country's election, watch it on television or stream it. Story 85. In favor. 3 more years of this. The highly reliable, triple redundancy system we have now will be destroyed, and it will be replaced with voting machines overseen by extremists. Story 86. I love it. Let's get 1 United Nations monitor per household to ensure that a mail-in ballot is filled out. They will monitor who actually completes the ballot. I'm in. Of course, that's not what you meant, but who knows, maybe I gave my ballot to my 9-year-old to fill out. If there was a monitor in my house, you would know for sure. Story 87. Oh my gosh, I love it. I didn't even realize there were solutions like this outside of our difficult situation. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.